Hi, everyone. I'm here with Victoria Lee, the author of A Shot in the Dark, which was just recently published at the beginning of September. And I'm super excited to talk with her about this amazing queer romance that explores identity, art, photography, living in big cities, and just so many other things. Yeah, we're going to be talking a lot about the book today, and I am looking forward to discussing all kinds of questions with Victoria. So to start, Victoria, I'd love for you to just give readers a little bit of insight into the book and a quick elevator pitch as to what it's all about.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alex. So I'm Victoria Lee. I am the author of A Shot in the Dark, which is about this girl named Ellie who is finally returning to New York. She's spent the past 8 years in LA recovering from substance abuse issues after being expelled from her Orthodox Jewish community in New York because of those drug issues. And she's coming back because she wants to study photography at this prestigious art program under a notoriously reclusive but very famous photographer named Wyatt Cole. So her first night back, she and her friends go to this queer club and she has an amazing one night stand with this hot trans guy. And then, of course, she goes to school the next day and it's him. It's Wyatt Cole. It's the photographer idol of hers, who's her professor. So the book is about them navigating that relationship, lots of yearning because of like the forbidden nature of this relationship and their both of their kind of ethical qualms about it. But it's also about substance abuse recovery as both characters are in recovery. It's about found family and finding your place in religion and spiritual community as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such a great description of the book, and really gives readers great insight into what this story is all about. The first question I wanted to ask you actually was about how you decided to make Ellie an artist, and of course Wyatt, her love interest, is also an artist, specifically photographers. And when I was reading this book, I really noticed how right from the get go you kind of established that Ellie is an artist, and that's kind of how she sees the world. So what about this story that you were trying to tell was important to you to kind of filter it through the lens of an artist and more specifically a photographer?
Yeah, so as an artist or writer, it was important to me to, have a chance in a book to really talk about my experience with art, my experience with like learning how to express myself through art, through writing, and that careful balance you have to construct between vulnerability and like, showing truth and like real experiences through the book, but also like having this protective boundary of it being fiction. Um, so I chose Ellie being an artist because I felt like this is, especially with her story being about substance abuse recovery and being about like all of these very intimate emotional things, like having art, having this extremely vulnerable, this extremely emotional outlet for her was a great counterpoint to that. It was a great way for her to be able to explore those feelings and those realities of hers through some kind of like healthy medium. Uh, as for photography specifically, it's mostly because that's one of the few non-writing art forms I know anything about is like photography and dance. Like I
Yeah.
would never write something about somebody drawing because I'm a terrible drawer. So like I had a phase where I was very into photography. So I knew like just enough about that to sound not ridiculous. And then like I had friends who were more into it that I could just mine for content and mine for details. So I liked that. I also liked that it kind of she's very interested in mixed media photography, so it blends this realism of like a photo of a real person, a photo of a real thing, with this like kind of more abstract ability to like incorporate sculpture or like textiles. So it I don't want to say it was like necessarily an intentional metaphor, but as I was
Hmm.
writing the book, it kind of did feel like it lended itself perfectly to the story and that she is like facing these very real things, but trying to process it through art and like in the art itself, taking these real these and then processing them through this filter of like mixed media and abstraction.
Yeah, yeah, I think it works so well, having her be a photographer, and just as she's sort of going through these new challenges and her relationship with Wyatt, kind of having that other lens or way to sort of express herself through her photography is just such a, like another amazing layer to the book. Another thing I noticed from the beginning of the book is that you do such a great job, kind of talking about queer identities and how people identify themselves in what I felt was like a very realistic manner. Whether that's, you know, Ellie's roommates asking about her sexuality or her internal monologue at the beginning of the book, especially when they go to the gay club. So I was curious, when you were writing this manuscript, how did you find the right balance of trying to make talking about these queer identities believable while also kind of having, you know, respect for the LGBT plus community, which obviously you do throughout your writing as well?
Yeah, so just speaking from my personal experience as a queer and gender person, um, I wouldn't say that I'm like questioning, like I feel like I have a solid sense of what my queer identity is, but nevertheless, there is a constant like fluidity to it. There is like your identity can shift, your like feeling of like your place within the queer community or the trans community can shift. So for example, I've definitely been in queer and trans spaces where I felt very like centered or very included, where I felt like there were lots of other people who were like me. I've also been in spaces that are dominated by, for example, like cis gay men or people who are like strict binary transgenders, or like a more like androgynous non-binary, and where you've kind of had to have like more internal stability in how you identify, in order to like kind of have confidence in those spaces. And so with Ellie, she she doesn't like really have a defined label for what she is early in the book. Diego, her roommate, kind of asks her like, "Oh, are you like bisexual? Are you lesbian? Are you pansexual?" She's like, "I don't really know. Like this is like I know what I like. I know like how I feel." And then Diego's like, "Okay, so you're pan." And so he does kind of like impose an identity on her, but it's one that Ellie embraces. She's like, "Yeah, sure. Like that sounds reasonable. That sounds about right." Um, Meanwhile, Wyatt is a trans man, and so he like has this established identity. Like he's gone through medical transition. Like he is very socially transitioned. He passes very well. So for him, it's like very much like integrated into his life and to how like people perceive him. He spends a lot of time thinking about like, okay, he passes, and then people find out he's trans, and there's a multitude of ways that people can react to that. Um, and so for him, or well, for both of them, it's kind of like balancing act between like the security on your identity and like finding your place in the queer community and finding like the people who will accept you, like Ellie with her roommates and like Wyatt with his friend group and his Narcotics Anonymous community as well.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and you do such a great job of representing. I feel like the queer community, like I said, in a really realistic and thoughtful way. And that sort of leads me to the next question, which you were already talking about Wyatt's identity a little bit. But I was curious, like from the get go, like you know, this book is really built around these two co-leads, Ellie and Wyatt, and we learn of Wyatt being a trans man when they first meet, and I was wondering, is this something that like was always part of the book? Like when you first thought of this character of Wyatt, was he always a trans man? Or just I was curious if you could give up the readers a little bit of insight into how his identity sort of came to life for you and why you thought it was important to give this representation of a really you know, strong, beautiful, artistic trans man, especially in a time where you know trans people are being subjected to you know prejudice across the country.
Yeah, so yes, he was always a trans man in my mind. Um, I love telling queer stories and like as like I mentioned, like a trans person, I love telling trans stories. I had not had the opportunity yet to like write an explicit trans character. Like I've definitely had books from like in my head that person's trans. I mean, I did have like a non-binary character in A Lesson in Vengeance, but it was very much a side character. Like they like were not centered in the story like Wyatt is. And so I wanted to write a book where it's very like like classic romance, like the hero is sensitive and handsome and strong and passionate. And then I'm like, all right, it's everything that you like. It's everything you like about your cis male romance heroes. And he's trans. So like what of it? Like he's filling all those boxes. He's taking everything that you love and kind of showing readers how great like being trans is, how great being in a relationship with a trans person is. And yeah, like I mean, of course there is like an inherent politicism to any kind of inclusion of queer and trans people in literature. But I think for me, like when I was writing it, I wasn't sitting there like, oh, I'm making a political statement, like I'm being revolutionary. It was like, oh, I'm like writing about this like hot trans dude and he's hot. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I think that comes across on the page too, kind of like not making a big deal of his identity. It just feels very I don't know if casual is the right word, but it just feels very authentic. And people live these experiences every day in their identities, and I think you really succeeded in bringing Wyatt to life in that way, which is just awesome to read about. Another thing I noticed about your two co-leads is that they have a lot in common. So, of course, they're both photographers, but not only that, they're also actually both recovering from substance abuse. And that's a big part of the book. Their recoveries from addiction and just kind of, the back and forth struggles that one goes through, especially in a long-term struggle with addiction. So I'm curious kind of how that idea came into play, especially when you were first developing this manuscript, that not only was Ellie recovering from a substance abuse, but Wyatt is also in recovery, and kind of how that becomes such a big part of their story too.
Yeah, so I have always, or at least for a very long time, wanted to write a book about substance abuse recovery. I've had multiple ideas about substance abuse recovery, like kind of percolating in my mind. So in like my debut books, one of the main characters, or well, he's the love interest in the first book. He's one of the protagonists in the second book. One of the point of view characters struggles with substance abuse. He's very much like still in it, and it's not the main focus of the book. But like that was my first, I guess, foray into writing about a character with these issues. And like after that, I had in my mind, like, okay, I want to write a book that's focused on this. And I had multiple different books that kind of took this form. A lot of them were like people still struggling, people like going to rehab, seeking help. But especially in writing a romance, I wanted this to be something that like, I mean, you could question like how much is like your recovery ever like completely stable? Like a lot of perspectives are like, oh, you'll always be an addict. Like that's the 12-step perspective. But I wanted to write something where the characters are like mostly secure in their recovery, partly because at least in like NA and I'm sure in AA as well, like there's this like kind of encouraged philosophy of like don't like start anything serious while you're in early recovery, and like certainly don't get involved like if you're somebody with a strong recovery with somebody who's like fresher in their journey. And so I wanted to write something where like that was something that the characters had in common, and like it was a big part of their stories and how they understand themselves and also each other, but it wasn't something that was like a threat to their self-concept or their safety or like their ability to form these very true connections with each other. So over the course of the book, like we do see one of the characters struggle with I don't want to call it a relapse, like a slip. We see like one of the characters kind of like have their like the emotional situation or like some of the things they're encountering, like the pressure becomes too great at one point. But the reaction of the other character is very much like, okay, like that's all right, that's understandable. Like you're not a bad person, your recovery's not over. Like you're not starting over from scratch. Like you did a thing. You don't want to do that thing again. Like you're still focused on your recovery. You're still making this like a part of who you are and of your life. And that was also important for me to include. It's like this like holistic view of recovery as not being linear and not being something that's like established forever, but also being something that can be very secure for you and that you can like keep coming back to. And even when like that, angle of recovery dips a little bit, that you can get back on track, you can keep going. And that's something that I think the two characters really offer each other, is this vision of what recovery and happiness in recovery can look like.
Yeah, I think, the two of them really work together and are sort of a support system for one another, even though they have this complicated relationship where Wyatt is in a place of authority, being her professor originally. But I feel like there's such a great ebb and flow between the two of them when they're dealing with these struggles, which just, makes the pages turn even easier because you never really know exactly how things are going to happen. But I found that to be a really intriguing part of the book. And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is just the point of view and how the story is actually told. So, for the most part, we're really experiencing the story through Ellie's point of view, and I think the majority of the chapters are told from her voice. But I really enjoyed that we also get to hear some of Wyatt's internal thoughts, and there are a handful of chapters throughout the book that are told from his perspective. Just some from a sort of storytelling position, what made you decide to not only include, Ellie's first person narration, but also to make sure that Wyatt kind of got to talk to the readers directly?
So the story for me, like from the conception of it, was very much Ellie's story. Like, most of the arcs are about like her recovery, her relationship with her family, her exploration of her artistic identity. And part of that is because all of those for her are very much more in flux. Like she's not as far along in her recovery as Wyatt. She's earlier in her career. She's closer like in a timeline to her break with her family than he is. So like she's got kind of more like progress to make or like more room to grow. Wyatt, on the other hand, I felt like it was important to include at least some chapters from his perspective, both like for the sake of their romantic relationship and showing like his investment in it, because for a lot of the book, he's like, be like, oh, like we can't be together because of like responsibility and ethics and power imbalances. And like I wanted to make sure that like the reader saw like, okay, but he's still like completely obsessed with her. Like, she's not like over here like pushing for something that he is like milk toast about. So partly that, and then also because I did want to have the perspective of somebody who's further along and more stable, and like how he views like her with her journey and like how it contrasts to his and how it brings up thoughts in him of like other points in his journey, but then how he contextualizes them in the larger course of his life. He's also like several years older than Ellie, so he has that additional life experience. So it's partly that, both of those things. It was also just, to me, I was very excited to write from the perspective of a trans person, to like put the reader in their head and see how if trans identity is always present in your life, it does inform a lot of things, but it's not the entirety of it. You're not like sitting there being like, I'm eating my cereal transly. Like it matters. It comes in, but like that's not like you're not sitting around like, oh, I'm trans, I'm trans, I'm trans. Um
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And really, I think that's so much about just the balance of those identities, and also it's really about the balance of these viewpoints. Like you said, I definitely felt like this was Ellie's story, but adding in Wyatt's perspective really just gives like a nice layer to kind of even just broaden those perspectives and give really kind of a more complete picture of this world that the two of them are living in. So I thought that was really really interesting. Another thing that I think you do so well is that you're not only talking about queer identities in this book, but you're also really exploring Ellie's Jewish identity, especially having been raised in a more conservative Jewish family where they're really following along some more conservative practices. So especially I think what's interesting in the book is that even though Ellie is struggling with her Jewish identity in a lot of ways, she decides to have her capstone project be about sort of different Jewish practices. So I was curious, when you were writing about these queer identities and these Jewish identities, did you find one to be a little bit easier than the other, or were there things that kind of were similar when you're writing about these religious identities versus these sexual identities, and kind of how they all just sort of came together to tell Ellie's story?
Yeah, so I definitely found writing about the queer identity to be easier. I think partly because um all of my books so far have been queer. So like it's something like it's a space I'm very comfortable in. It's something that I feel like I've talked about a lot before. It's something that feels so like integrated into the stories and the romances at this point that I don't really like have to think about it. Like I said earlier, I'm not sitting there being like, oh, political statement. It's just like, okay, like they're queer, sure. And like you do try and portray queerness like authentically and like with respect and sensitivity, but I don't feel like I was having to put as much thought into that as I was into Ellie's Jewish identity. I think particularly because, like you said, she did come from like a more Orthodox background, a more observant background, and now she's trying to find her place within Judaism. She ultimately finds her place in, again, another Orthodox community, just one that's like very different in structure, very different in like their focus. Like it's a very queer community. It's a very like trans-friendly community. So like for her, like thinking about like her coming back to this and centering her capstone on that, you know, even for example, as opposed to like on queerness, I think like coming back to like that point that I mentioned earlier too about like she's very secure in her queerness. She's not like still questioning. It's not a journey she's still on. It's just like an integrated part of her identity. Whereas her Jewishness is something that she still doesn't quite understand. I think that that's something that a lot of Jewish people have experienced or can relate to, is this like, even if the most Orthodox person in the world would be like, yes, you're Jewish, like you have a long matrilineal line. Like Ellie even talks about how she's from Good Yehus, like she has like this background of like esteemed rabbis going back like ages, like she is like unquestionably Jewish, but then like she still has this feeling like, oh, like am I a real Jew? Am I like a good Jew? Like do I even fit in the Jewish community? Do they even want me? And so that for her is something that's still very much a continuing journey.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation, and it's just really fascinating to kind of hear about how that came together for you when you're writing this book. And I think again, there's so many great layers to this story that make it feel so alive and so realistic. Because you know, as we're all living in today's complicated society, it's like we're not just struggling with one part of ourselves. You know, there's so many different facets about what make each of us individuals. And I thought the fact that you were exploring, you know, not only sexuality but also religion and even just art, just it all kind of mixed together in such an interesting way. And another thing I feel like I thought about while reading this book is sort of the interplay between Wyatt and Ellie and how they really feel towards one another and how they actually express how they feel towards each other. Because of course there's this complicated sort of power dynamic with Wyatt being her professor at this school that she's going to. And I feel like on page 180, you really summed that up with these two lines that I just want to read to anyone listening now, which are, you can't just say what you want to say outright, not in art and not in life either, not really. So I found this to be a really simple but profound statement that I feel like a lot of readers will relate to. And it just, again, I feel like is one of the themes of this book. So could you just kind of elaborate on those ideas and that as sort of a theme or an idea that you were trying to get across to readers with A Shot in the Dark?
Right. So as it pertains specifically to their relationship and to the power dynamic involved there, you know, there's this conversation they have earlier in the book where it kind of makes it clear that there is no good solution. Like, you know, fate or happenstance or coincidence has like put them into this position, and almost like no matter what either of them does, the power imbalance doesn't go away. Like it's why it's very concerned about his responsibility here. Like at first he's like, oh, I can't be your professor, you have to drop my class. And Ellie points out like, okay, like cool, so then you get to feel ethical, but that's bad for my career. Like this is why I'm here, I wanted to study with you, so like you can't like set these boundaries between us and remove the power dynamic in terms of like you grading me, because then you impose like this other dynamic. Like there's no escape from it, like this is just where we are. And so that's something that like they both struggle with, and Wyatt in particular feeling like, you know, even as his feelings for Ellie develop, it's something that if he were to tell her like, okay, I love you, that would make her so happy. Like that would be like, that's what she wants. But also like, he can't just say that because of all of these other issues. Like what happens if they do get together and then they break up? Like, is that also bad for her career? So it's something that they're very much struggling with throughout the book. And then I think that, like you mentioned with the other line on page 180, it gets reflected in the art. Art in general, you know, I mentioned earlier that it's this balancing act between vulnerability and authenticity of emotional experience with like protective boundaries and with this transformation into a fictional lens. But both of them as well, like finding that balance within their art, finding a different kind of balance in their relationship. It's like very much parallel plot lines.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And again, I just feel like that line was sort of something that stuck out to me because it connects to so many of the different things that both Ellie and Wyatt are struggling with. You know, like sometimes you wish you could just be direct and fix the problem or say what you're really thinking, but it's not always that simple. And I felt like that was just such a interesting point of reflection in the story. Um, so one of my other questions actually is about the acknowledgments of the book, which as someone who works in publishing, I typically always tend to read the acknowledgments just because I find it really fascinating to sometimes learn a little bit about how the book came together. And in your acknowledgments, I noticed how you mentioned a TikTok that I think you said your agent had sent to you. So
Yeah.
if you're willing or able to share, I was just so curious about like what the TikTok was and kind of how it helped inform the idea behind this book.
Right. So I was like hanging out at home playing Civilization 6 as one does, and I get this email and it's from my agents and it's like 11 at night. They're in California, so it's a very like different time difference. And they're like, "Yeah, we saw this TikTok and like we thought that you should write a book that's like this TikTok that just has like these vibes and like this like hot like eroticism, but like make it trans." I was like, "Ooh, okay, I'm already intrigued." And I watched the TikTok, and God, I wish I could like find it or just like my email inbox is just like a complete trash fire. But it's essentially of this like non-binary person talking about how the first time that you like a woman has sex with a non-binary or a trans person, the joke is like, "Oh, you keep coming and coming and coming." It's like, okay, yes, I have to write this.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's so fascinating, you know, where the spark of ideas tend to come from, especially in today's world where we're kind of being told different stories all the time, whether it's, you know, in a TikTok or another kind of online article or post. So I was just really curious as to how that came about. And I think that's really, really exciting that that's how that came together. So thank you so much for giving all of this insight into A Shot in the Dark. It's really exciting to just kind of hear about your thought process behind creating Ellie's story and just how all of these different amazing plot lines came together. But before we wrap up, one question I always like to ask authors is to talk about maybe some other queer books or other books that you've read recently by LGBTQ plus authors that you've really enjoyed, or just kind of any just book recommendations that people who are paying attention to our channel should check out if you've read anything of recent that really stuck out to you.
So two books came immediately to mind because they're books that I'm very obsessed with right now. The first one is Chain Gang All Stars by Nana Ajay Brenia. It's got a lesbian main couple. It's kind of this exploration of the commodification of violence and lesbianism and Black women in the media, as well as like the prison industrial complex. I'm making this sound very bleak, and like it is bleak, but like it also has a beautiful lesbian romance at the center of it, as well as Beholder by Ryan Lasala. I am obsessed with all of Ryan's work. The Honeys is also amazing. You should check that out too. But Beholder is about this character, Ethan, who has this kind of like generational family curse where he can see like things that have happened in the past or in like the future, like through mirrors. And he's kind of gets caught up in this spiral and like this like weird, like secret underground art world in New York City where he's trying to, you know, save a bunch of people, like the whole save the world thing, but also like dealing with this like malevolence that keeps approaching him through the mirror that keeps like getting closer and closer, this mysterious like dread. It's an amazing horror book. It has a gay male main couple. It's so excellent. Both of these books, honestly, I could, you know, wax poetic forever about. Definitely read them both. Very different vibes, but both.
Yeah. Yeah, those both sound great, especially the latter. That sounds like the perfect kind of read for spooky season now that we're in October. So I'll have to check those
Really,
out.
it comes
Yeah.
today. It's out today. It's October
Oh,
3rd.
amazing.
This interview is happening, so you can read it
Okay.
right now.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you for sharing those. I'm sure our readers will enjoy hearing those recommendations as well. So I just want to say again, thank you, Victoria, for taking the time to chat with me today. And thanks to anyone listening. A Shot in the Dark was published in the beginning of September and is available now wherever books are sold. So you should definitely go and check it out. And thank you again, Victoria, for chatting with us.
Thank you so much, Alex. I had a great time.